chapter 42, Ayin Beis, page Ayin Aleph, 71. We are in midst of, close to the beginning of Discourse number 11. Tzim b'mishpat tipada, which the Friedrich Rabbi categorizes as being the Teichen Ascholas HaMaimah. The content of the beginning of the discourse is Chochma, binah, Ayin Beis. So to sum up where we are, after explaining the concept of Maila Mata, what we call conceptual space, meaning the conceptual levels, which define the structure of existence. Remember, everything here is in a theory level because we're not talking about physical space, we're talking about conceptual space. Maila Mata, as he calls it, higher and lower degrees, which he defined, the Rabbi Rashab defined as being based on miyut and ribui, meaning how much intensity, energy there is and how little energy there is. And two, kiruv and richuk, how close or how distant they are from the source. And that defines what something is higher or something is lower. And an example has been using is Chochma and binah, which, as I explained, is both an example to understand structure of higher and lower, with Chochma being of a different personality, fundamental, essential, different personality than binah. Chochma is like riyah, seeing, which is tefes and mahus. It grasps the essence of something, whereas binah is only the expression, only grasps the expression, the mitzias of something. But besides being an example, it also, in a microcosm, captures the two states of one being more of a gilei helam, revealing that which is divine, and the other is much more connected to the yesh of existence, to the personality of existence. So understanding how Chochma and binah interact with each other in a way, macrocosmic, is a way to understand how the divine interacts with existence. Except this is on a cognitive level, meaning how the human mind, which evolves from the cosmic mind, the divine mind in Atzilus, works. So chapter 41 essentially was the question that he asked. That we say that Chochma and binah are fundamentally different. That was what was discussed in previous chapters. So Amram Adayin Tzarech Lov, we still have to understand. At the end of the day, Chochma is cognitive. Chochma is not faith. Chochma is not ratzon, desire, keser, that's beyond the structure. It's also part of the cognitive skills. And especially the lower levels of Chochma, where we grasp the idea. He said Yesod Abba and so on. So that makes it much more similar to binah, to comprehension. So how then can we say that Chochma is not just binah is not just diminished Chochma. Binah is not just diminished energy. Chochma is of a different personality, as we discussed earlier. It's not that the abundance and the lack of energy is a result, not a cause. A result of the fundamental difference between Chochma and binah. So since Chochma is a cognitive skill like binah is, how can we say it's fundamentally higher? So first, on a simple explanation, he wanted to say that you could say that maybe he's talking about that we're talking about that this is talking about a diminished dimension in Chochma itself. Like we discussed earlier, in order for the teacher to apply himself to the student, so within the teacher, within Chochma itself, you need to have a diminished form of energy. Whereas Chochma on its own, however, is beyond. But the Rabbi Rashab did not accept that answer. He says, because it's not just a diminishment. When it goes into binah, there's a fundamental change, shift, like a paradigm shift. And you cannot say, this is the rule that he applied in Perek Memal, if you can't say something, an entity can, within its own self, shift from one personality to another. In other words, the definition of structure is that a thing cannot change personality. He's made that clear at the top of the page, Ayin Aleph. It's an important concept because it adds a very critical element here, and that is You cannot say that one level. It says that in its individual levels there should be a fundamental paradigm shift from one state to another. So you can say that a personality can get diminished. Let's say a teacher can communicate an idea and manifest it, malbish it, in the examples, bring it down to diminished energy, diminish, but all within the same concept. To suddenly shift over to a completely different type of paradigm, you can't stay on the same level. And therefore, you cannot just answer that binah is just diminished Chochma. You have to say they have fundamentally different personalities. And so he answered the question, beginning to answer the question, that the Chochma binah now he's introducing the words Ayin and Yesh. That Chochma is fundamentally a level of Ayin, which is a state of lack of substance, substanceless. And binah is Yesh, substance. There have been Ayin v'Yesh, and he explained the difference between Ayin and Yesh and Il v'Ol. Il v'Ol has a certain proportionate connection between the cause and the effect. I spoke about earlier about two types of Il v'Ol, but they both have a connection at the end of the day. Whereas in Yesh Ma'ayin and Il v'Ol is through the revelation of the higher level, diminished, it becomes a cause, becomes an effect. But Yesh Ma'ayin Adrabi, he says, for something to come out of so-called a new entity comes from the concealment of the higher entity. And in that context, in that sense, Chochma therefore is infinitely distant in a way from binah, fundamentally different. How do you explain that? So the answer is, even though you say binah comes is in the comprehension within Chochma, and Chochma is understood through binah, the answer is that you have to say that in Chochma, the way we comprehend something, the way we grasp something, they basically, what radiates there is a sense of awe, a sense of subtlety that comes from the source. So he's introducing here, at the end of chapter Ayin Al, Mem Aleph, chapter 41, he's introducing that that there's a certain sense of awareness in Chochma that binah does not have. So even though binah comprehends the concept, but the primary aspect that dominates in Chochma is the ayin of it, which is that something that is beyond the comprehension. Chochma senses there's something beyond comprehension. Binah does not. And that becomes the primary driving force of what Chochma is about.
I think Binah's senses is beyond Binah's comprehension. I wouldn't say, I don't know if it,
that's not what it, no, Chochma senses.
That he's beyond.
Chochma senses
On
that
himself.
That's seichel in general,
Ayin
yeah.
On himself.
Yeah.
He calls himself Ayin.
Binah doesn't at all relate to that.
That's why it's called Ayin.
Okay.
Yeah, because Binah doesn't relate to it. But Ayin doesn't consider it.
Did you read it inside, or you're saying your own theory now?
No, this is what we
Really? He says the Gemara becomes the Mekudas Haskal Mer Ha'er Begilu Kshabab Asab B'Riv Plat Misalim. What does it say? That in the Kudah of Chochma, that in the Chochma is Meir radiates the etzem of the Sichli. Mashi'i efshe be'emes love ba'asaga. The essence of the Seichel radiates there. That can't come down to comprehension. It says in the summary as well, Chochma there radiates something that's higher than comprehension. Binah can only relate to the comprehension part, the concept of the logic part. But the part of part of Chochma that is higher than Seichel, which is the main part of Chochma, Binah doesn't relate to.
Right.
Okay, but Chochma does relate to it.
Right.
So Chochma is fundamentally a state of Ayin,
Right.
of higher than substance.
Right.
So,
But not to himself, to Binah.
no, to himself also. That's the whole
I
point.
don't understand. Okay.
That's why it's only a spark. It's not a comprehension. But Chochma doesn't have comprehension. What would be if we only had Chochma and no Binah? Tell me. We wouldn't have any understanding of anything.
Yeah, but we're lower.
No. I'm talking about from the Chochma level. What's that?
Okay.
What is Chochma without Binah? Chochma. He says Chochma can be. He said earlier, The Chochma cannot be understood without binah. It says here. So Chochma on its own doesn't have a problem with a state of awe. A state of being like in the bridge between where the unconscious meets the conscious. Chochma is at that little place where the unconscious meets the conscious. It's fine. From Chochma's point of view, that's its state. It doesn't need... it's comfortable with Ayin, basically. That's the point. We'll learn later that Chochma is Ma'ayin Temotzah. Chochma is also, compared to its source is also Ayin. Okay. Binah, however, its whole nature, its personality is I understand, I comprehend. So the idea that which is beyond the comprehension part, binah cannot relate to. So it's really not a contradiction. Huh? Fine. So chapter Ayin Beis now. He's continuing the discussion here. So in chapter 42, the bottom of page Ayin Aleph 71. Omnom nida v'nirgish hadavar. However, it's qualifying now something. Nida, we can sense v'nirgish and feel. Nida, we can sense, we can see. V'nirgish and sense, they both sense. Nida is more we can see and sense. We can relate to, we can... Omnam nida v'nirgish hadavar, we can sense hadavar, this thing, it's an interesting expression, nida v'nirgish hadavar. We can sense this reality. Shagam hasichli dechochma be'etzem eina inyan hasag be'emes. Going now further. That the sichli of Chochma, the intelligence that we call cognitive, what he asked before the question, isn't seichel, see the question was the havamina, the consideration was that Chochma is cognitive. It's just a higher cognitive than binah. He's moving the other way around. He's making Chochma less. Yeah. He's making our Chochma even more, less state of intelligence, more of a state of beyond intelligence. Obviously leading to the point where Chochma is like where the divine, that's beyond intelligence, meets intelligence. The first point where they meet. So you see, we work our way from the bottom up. We can't relate to that. By us, we reach the Chochma, we don't know how to go further. I understand something. Okay, I understand. I should have a little bit. L'reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. The beginning of wisdom requires some humility. That's the most that most intelligent people will reach. But no one's going to say that intelligence began in a place that was beyond intelligence, and that became intelligence, and then became binah. No, once we think we're it, we think we're the center of the universe, and good, okay, fine, there's something behind the scenes. The truth is, as I explained with an analogy, the reservoir of water, the source of water is where it's at. We're only getting a drop after it comes through the pipes and the faucet. Don't convince yourself your drop of water is the essence of reality. It's one piece. It's essentially, really, if you think about it in contemporary terms, he's demolishing the worship of Seichel that the Enlightenment introduced, and what science introduced, where science became God. Don't make it God. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's a drop, and a very powerful drop, that reflects something, but its real power is that it comes from something beyond intelligence itself. And everyone's making this big fuss about the Higgs boson. How do you pronounce it? Boson? Boson? The God particle. The truth is, people don't know that. The truth is, they called it, without using an expletive, they said, what's the goddamn particle that we're looking for? And when the guy wrote the book, they took out the damn, so they called it the God particle. But they didn't mean to say the God particle, they meant to say almost like a curse word. Where the hell is that particle?
This week has the thing that it's the anti-God particle.
So what do you say about it?
I still have to read about it. I'm not so worried from the Kalim. Everyone does.
Like they don't want to get to God, basically.
First of all, that's right. I think when they introduced it, they said thank nature. That was as a joke. He said instead of saying thank God, he said thank nature. People laughed. I don't see how this particle really changes anything in the context of God.
Isn't it like closer to this?
On the contrary, it's a critical component. But it seems to me is that it's a critical component in understanding, in confirming what they call the standard atomic model. That's really what it is. The question was, what particle creates mass? In other words, the shaila is what makes something stick together.
Getting closer to no mass.
That's part. Every development, from my point of view, you're going to get closer, but you're only going to reach a point of chochma. Yesh can only reach yesh. You're going to need to have a jump to ayin is going to require a step that doesn't necessarily come purely from a. I think it's still scientific because it's from my point of view to tell you that logic leads to a place that created logic is very scientific from my point of view. Because why is it logical? At the end of the day, why is the science? Why is the universe a logical universe? No scientist can answer that question. They call it the entropic principle. They have all kinds of different theories, but no one can understand why. It could have easily been an unlogical universe. It could have been a chaotic universe where there's nothing predictable. See, it's all based. That's an axiom, a muskulition that nobody really can understand. Why do we assume that there's a logic behind it all?
Science say the same thing, that we have this predictable and non-predictable.
But even non-predictable is also with a logic. There's no just non-predictable like wild. It's not. Unpredictable means it's a state of probability. But based on that, many scientific theories are developed, and we have computers and we have technologies that are built on these non-predictable realities. But it's not random. It's not unpredictable. Is not random. It means indeterministic. It's not defined. It's like more in a state of potential. That doesn't mean that there's no system there. That's also part of the system. It's not just complete. So that's a whole other story. The point I'm making here, however, that you could say that the Rebbe Rashab is doing this. The truth is, he's looking for the interface between existence and beyond. And the mind Chochma is clearly the place of interface because Chochma is the Reishish Shtalshalos. If you want to define where does the divine energy, that's Bli Gvul, manifest the first time in Gvul, the first sphere is Chochma. Keser, I'm not talking about Keser. Keser is more the will, the desire. It's also a sphere, but I'm talking about in Gilui, Chochma. Whether it's Ezer Sphere Sagnuzis Chochma, or like we spoke, the three levels of the spheres in the vision, or after the Tzimtzum, or in Atzilus, but it's always Chochma is the first. So Chochma really, what he's going to, this is what we're traveling, is like going deeper into Chochma. So in the beginning, you can just say Chochma is the spark of an idea that's fleshed out in binah. And clearly, he's developing the case here that Chochma is an entity of its own, and like you're saying, he's going even further. In the last chapter, he said that in Chochma radiates the etzem hasichli, which is fundamentally higher than seichel, and binah cannot relate to that. That's why Chochma is called Ayin, binah yesh. Now he's going Oman nirge v'nirge shadover. It's interesting how he says it. He's like almost saying that up his seichel. When you say nirge v'nirge shadover, he's not saying it says in Eitz Chaim or the Alter Rebbe said that Chochma is really higher than saying. He said nirge v'nirge shadover. That when you really start thinking about Chochma, you have to logically conclude almost that it's the Chochma be'etzem ein inyan hasoga be'emes. The Chochma fundamentally is not really a comprehension. It's not really a cognitive tool. The be'ikar hu inyan hanocha b'nefesh. He's introducing now a new concept, hanocha b'nefesh. That's what he's saying. No, nirgish as Chochma is hanocha. Let's read it. The be'ikre. The Chochma be'ikre primarily is the inyan of hanocha b'nefesh. Now we're going to have to translate hanocha b'nefesh. He does translate in Yiddish. You right away see that it requires some type of explanation. Hanocha b'nefesh literally means hanocha means like he says alegi nefesh was be'em leitzich dezach hazeh. This can take a few hours to explain this parenthesis itself. Let's talk about alegi nefesh. In Yiddish, it's saying it in Yiddish. Anything in Yiddish, you can right away know that the Rebbe Rashab really wants to bring it into. He wrote it. It's not just what he said. He wrote those words. So it means he's trying to explain it in, Yiddish for the Rebbe Rashab was like English for us. It's a language that brings down a concept into, Gershon Ber Pahara said, that my nefesh habamis versteht besser Yiddish. He said that by yem echad la'emer. He said, ein tag, heint is ein tag in emer. It says my nefesh habamis, my animal soul understands better Yiddish. So sometimes when you have to speak to you have to speak your language. Like, you curse at yourself in Russian? Yeah, when you talk to yourself. You say, you start yelling at Yitzhahar in Russian. Everyone's got their language. So, what is alegin nefesh here? The word hanocha, let's start with the word hanocha. Hanocha is actually the same word we used to use for hanochas. Yamaniach, to place, to commit to paper. So we say that we heard the Rebbe's words and then put it on paper. It was called hanocha, which means you put it. It's an interesting word. Hanocha and halacha is akira v'hanocha. In Shabbos, the laws of Shabbos, what makes something havorim and shus, moving something from one property to another, say private property to public. So it requires not just moving it. If you move your hand out the door, it's not considered hanocha. You have to place. Hanocha means you have to place it, and akira means you have to lift it. Someone told me once that they were walking on Kingston Avenue. It was Friday night late. They see Rabbi Mentlik standing and trembling right before his house on the street. He saw the Likutei Sichos on the floor. He didn't know what to do. Because on one hand, Shabbos, he's a from. On the other hand, a Sikha from the Rebbe. He couldn't bring himself. So I said, "What did he do?" He found some. He moved it. But there's ways to do it. I think he found one of these tricks. It was right near his house, so it wasn't like so complicated. But there's all kinds of methods if you have to move something.
Put it on a pump, on a hydrogen, because it's a makir.
So then it's not a real. It's not a real hanocha. Yeah. That's a shusayachid. So unless he holds it, what happens if a person just stands and holds something? It's not considered alpidin akira.
Where do you get it?
No, let's say he picked it up with Rosh Hashanah and he holds something. It doesn't walk.
Yes, it's walk somebody else.
100%.
And if he walks and doesn't put it down, and doesn't go into another rishus, he walks the.
No, but he walked out of that's another thing.
That's a different thing. That's more it's havara.
Yeah, he walks under.
If he walks non-stop. No, but he says 4 hours. But it's not mitzad akira v'anocha. That's mitzad. Okay.
But he can stop. He
cannot put it down.
What?
Even if he'll walk, let's say, less than 4 hours, like till he's out,
somebody.
he won't be able to put it down.
Yeah, he could hand it to somebody, and the other person can hand it to another person, and they can go all the way to.
To where? Then somebody will put it
To
down.
the shusay yachid. So one person did akira, one person did anocha.
Right, then it's.
Yeah, that's.
Even the rabbanon, that's allowed.
And also Navad and Shusarabim.
You can get several people to stand around, and they'll make a rishis yachid.
No, that's only bleed das. That's without their das.
They don't know about it. They should know about it.
Okay, all this is to understand aleg in nefesh. Okay, now I'm just going to say the word hanocha means to place. That's what it technically means. But what does it mean in psychologically or cognitively speaking? What he's saying is aleg in nefesh is a type of like. I don't want to use the word intuition because that's a different word. Because to intuit something means you sense that something is going on. You sense. Hanocha is more of a leg. It's like that's just it's more of a sense. It's a sense that this is just correct. You may not be able to explain why. You just sense this is right. It's almost resonance. It would almost be a resonating element. I don't know if I can find a word. I mean, I'm sure there are words, and we'll put it out there. I hope somebody finds a good word. So. Actually, let's go in we're going in the linguistic search. Fine. I intentionally like to look for the word. There may be a word. There may be a combination of words. I would say right now, what was leitzach b'mir, my hanocha, that hanocha is a type of resonance, not through a process. Not that after hearing, let's say, a lot of information, something resonates, but a resonance that happens right at the outset. Like when the Rebbe Rashab told Reb Chaim Brisker, the famous story, I think I mentioned it, where there was that the Haskalah wanted to. There's different changes they wanted to make. One of them was to print a siddur in German and Hebrew. And that was their language. The German was the language of the Enlightenment. And there was a meeting, a sifa, the Rabbanim in Russia, in Moscow, I think it was. The two main rabbis were Reb Chaim Brisker and the Rebbe Rashab, and they had veto power. They were basically the final say. So most rabbis said, it's not maybe. We know their intentions, but it's not halachically permissible. You see, we have English Siddurim today. You can even have, because the question whether to make only an English Siddur without any Hebrew. That's why we have English and Hebrew. But technically, you probably can make even an English Siddur. Depends how you qualify it, etc. So, but the Rebbe Chaim, they came to Rebbe Chaim Brisker's time to vote, and he turned to the Rebbe Rashab, wanted to see what the Rebbe Rashab would do. The Rebbe Rashab thought for a moment, and then he said, no, he's against it. So Chaim said, if the Rebbe is against it, I'm also against it. Afterwards, in private, he says to the Rebbe, between you and me, we both know that halachically it's all right. So the Rebbe Rashab said, I train my body that from the youngest age, when something is not right, not up Shulchan Aruch, not, my body just tightens up, I just feel inside of me something's wrong. I just felt something's wrong. So Chaim later said to his students, that's why he deferred to the Rebbe Rashab, because he didn't have that type of sense. Now this is not talking about Ruach HaKodesh. They didn't say that. He didn't say I saw something happening, or I see the future, or my father told me. it means that there's a certain point where a person, I can't say this is exactly hanocha b'lev, because you could say that comes from faket, the opposite. After years of being trained a certain way, he could trust his instincts. His instinct. He's not saying instinct here. Nira v'nirgish is more instinct. Hanocha b'nefesh is not instinct. Hanocha b'nefesh means a leg that you just sense that's how it is. Let's read on to see how he explains it. But I'm just trying to explain. It says a leg in nefesh. If you know Yiddish, you get it. Can you any words that you can add to this? Anybody? The Rebbe Rashab doesn't just say a leg in nefesh. He says was be'em leiktzich de zachar. He just senses. He just feels. He feels that way. But you see, the hanocha is not feel. It's not nirg. It's not hargoshe. Hanocha is a leg. It's a seichel. It's. You see, it's not faith. It's not faith. We're not talking about he's going by faith. My emunah says, my seichel says one thing, my intelligence says one thing, my faith says another. It's clearly an intellectual, almost determination that's how it is. Now, you could have a very negative hanocha. There are people, for example, that are convinced of something, and they're just not open to hearing any argument. Here, obviously, he's talking about they're convinced of something, but because for the right purposes. Okay, that's he goes on. And even though this is not the hanocha, this is not the reality, the resonance that comes from seeing ki'im mitzad haskola. So even though he said before Chochma, the highest levels, remember, is riyah, he's not talking about Chochma as being the highest levels of, like you saw something. He's talking about Chochma now as being a concept, the beginning of a concept. So he says it's not on the same level as when you see something. When you see something, there's a certain reality that resonates. That we said hisamtus. Certain truth that just speaks to you. Here it's mitzad haskola. Hinasikli gufu b'derech hanocha le b'derech hasaga. So he's saying in seichel itself, there's a level where in the seichel itself is a level of hanocha and not from comprehension. So in other words, there's almost like two ways that seichel would work, is what he's saying, intelligence. One way is someone makes a case for something. That's binah. Begin to explain something, I don't know what yet, and you start making a case. You say, you know what? Here's the reasons we should do something. And they explain it very well. One reason, another reason, and you're convinced. Then you're convinced. That came through hasaga. Then there's haskola, he's saying, that comes from a form of hanocha. It's not from comprehending and developing and analyzing. It's just a type of sense that this is the way it is. So then the question is, what's the seichel in it? If it's hanocha, why are you calling it seichel? Well, so what's the the intelligence within this is hainu masha shaykh lasaga hu b'chinas hachetzenis levad. So he's saying actually the seichel in it, any part of it that does have seichel, which means that which is capable, possible to understand and comprehend, is only an external part. The primary thing of Chochma is hanocha. I have a few things to say. I just want to see how it's going to go here. My thinking right now would be like, let's talk about remember we discussed, it's very hard to talk about Chochma without binah. When you have an idea, let's take an example. There's a problem on the table. We talk about the problem, let's say, between the secular and the religious in Israel. Okay? Or we talk about some technological problem. Or we talk about an issue here in Crown Heights. I never said Crown Heights on the Ayin Beis because this is global. Or a problem in any community. Whether it's a personal problem, whether it's a psychological problem, a social issue, a frum issue, and so on. And people sit down and brainstorm. And then, as someone suddenly comes up with an idea, you don't even have to share the idea. Where's that idea come from? Not really easy to quantify where it came from. Right. So an idea falls into your head.
Also, sometimes when you're talking about an idea falls into that.
Right, and so an idea suddenly pops up, and at that moment when you have the idea, obviously some ideas are cockamamie ideas and are worthless. We're not talking about those. But let's say out of 500 ideas, 100 ideas, one idea is really a solid one, and when you develop it, you find out at the end, that was a brilliant idea. Someone says, where'd you get the idea from? I say, I don't know, it just came to me. It gives a discussion, maybe it reminded me of something. Who knows? We can't really always identify. But that moment when the idea came, how would we define this moment? This aha moment, that moment. Which even the person who had the idea may not yet even know how powerful the idea is. Many times, many ideas, later, you appreciate it a lot later than at the time. What really is happening? Is this an intellectual thing that's happening, a cognitive thing, or not? So he's saying here, he's not talking about riyah. We're not talking about seeing something. I see something, like, you're walking down the street, you see something, the seeing is believing. You see it, something, we're not talking about seeing. You're talking about something that's coming into, it's a cognitive thing. So he's saying here that initially we could say it's seichel, but it's a little higher than comprehension. It's not yet developed seichel. What he's saying now is no, that it's hanocha, something that's what he says, nirav and nirgish, that something from some place is telling you this is a solution. You have not yet fleshed it out. You can't even make a case for it, frankly, because it's not been developed yet. You just, So I'm talking about a good idea. You could say, well, what about a bad idea? A bad idea, fine. A bad idea is not a hanocha. A bad idea is someone who has a bad mind. A rebbe, for example, has a hanocha, is not going to be a bad one. Right. So hanocha means that it's the seichel shebazeh, the comprehension of it, the explanation of it is already only an external part. That's already making a case. But where did it begin from? It began from a flash, a hanocha, a zelek, certain resonating truth, and then you start developing it. That's what he's saying. The etzem of this idea is in the form of hanocha. That's how it resonates. Think of hanocha resonate. It's not the translation of hanocha, but it's definitely the meaning of hanocha. Hanocha means leitzach. It's leitzach, but resonating is a very good word, because resonate means you just sense something is right. And then that's that. And that comes. So Chochma, in other words, remember, all this is coming to explain that Chochma fundamentally is a different state of being than binah. So fundamentally, it gets things. It's like it's a getter of things. It gets the truth. Chochma, that's where it radiates the truth of something. Okay.
Hanocha can relate to Hasoga.
Yeah, hanocha could. He says hanocha then, because once, for example, let's say someone comes up with the idea, you say, you know what? Let's talk about it. You start developing it. He's saying the primary says the ikar. Primarily, ikre. The ikar thing of Chochma, he's adding now, is that Chochma has a new primary. He's defining Chochma not just as the beginning of an idea, but that's hanocha that then is developed and so on. Let's continue.
It's still Yesh Mi'ayin, Chochma.
For sure, that's what makes it ayin. That's what he's going to say. That's what makes it ayin. That he said already at the beginning of the end of last chapter. That it's ayin, we know. The question is, why is it ayin? He's explaining now. He's going further than just saying it's ayin.
Why is it not the sichli of Chochma like the sichli basically of binah?
That he answered already in the previous chapter. He said that Chochma is a level of ayin and binah is a level of yesh. And he explained Chochma has the etzem. He says Meir etzem sichli. That's higher than hasoga. Now he's going further, that the primary thing of Chochma is this hanocha, and not the comprehension is not its primary. And this is what we see. This is what we see, that when a person struggles and exerts himself in any item, in any idea that is not understood, that he doesn't understand, and when he comes to the depth and the inner dimension of this idea, and it falls into his mind that it's so and so, she's giving now an example how it plays itself out. I mean, I stated it, but he's saying it now specifically. So you begin here. I mentioned a problem. There's some dilemma, something ain't a moving lay, something that he does not understood to him. So what happens? He starts struggling, but he comes to the Emek HaPnimis, and suddenly something falls into his head that it should be so and so. This happens. You have a dilemma. It could be a dilemma over a period of time. Then suddenly, the Kud of Chochma falls into your head. So when it radiates, so Misyashu Inyan B'Teiv, Misyashu, that it's Misyashu says as Vert Merech der Inyan Unzeir Gut. He suddenly has a sense that this is it. I don't know if you've ever had such an epiphany, but an epiphany would be a type of a dilemma, and then suddenly you come to a solution. It's almost like sometimes you have a dilemma, you don't even know how you're going to get out of it. And then you come to an answer, something just falls in your mind, some type of like spark. Like he says here again in Yiddish, he feels the correctness of it. He more than that, he feels the sense of the solution, the correctness of the solution, and that very good, and also very good. It's a type of inner satisfaction, and satisfaction of suddenly discovering the solution to a problem, and it's only a spark at this point. Now, next step, and when he begins to then bring into definitive and detailed comprehension this inyan, this concept, how and what this thing is, and always he begins to flesh it out and break it down. It still does not necessarily. It still does not necessarily resonate or Messiashiv. It's not internalized by him at all. In other words, once you take from the spark, when you had that suddenly that epiphany, you sensed the truth in it. Once you brought it into Seichel and Hasogi, you began to explain it. Then you don't have that same resonance. You don't have that same sense of truth. The reason why? Because once it came, because once it came into binah, the hanocha that he had, that resonance that he had in the beginning, earlier became concealed. He's basically proving the case. Because why should it be concealed? If you had an epiphany and now you're fleshing it out, why in the fleshing out don't you have the same sense of resonance? Why doesn't it have that same type of like absolutely correctness? Because there's something here that's not logical. So if binah was just an extension, an explanation of Chochma, and Chochma is just the beginning process of a spark that later is fleshed out in binah, in comprehension, binah should continue to basically flow like ilavolo, cause and effect. It should continue to flow. That resonance you had in the idea should continue to extend and spill over into your comprehension. So he says no, because there's something that happens in Chochma that's not comprehension alone. It's a hanocha. Because that which in the beginning, initially, he came to the depth and the internal, the inner dimension of this concept was in a form of not seichel. It was a form of resonance. It was a form of seleitzach. That's how it settles in his mind. That's how he just relates. That's how he just connects to it. Hanocha could also be like a connection. You connect to it. And it's not seichel alone. It's not intelligence alone. So you see what he's saying here? That's why binah can go so far away from Chochma, because it's not just you take an idea like, let's say you take a drop of water and then you spread it out. What you spread out is going to be exactly what was original water, it's just now spread out. You take a little flame and you make a big flame from it. It's not going to change personality. Why is binah not able to relate to that type of resonance that Chochma has? Because Chochma is not just seichel. There's hanocha. There's something that Chochma has that's coming from another place. That's not just purely the beginning flow of intelligence. This, in a way, is beginning to, explaining already the interface side, that Chochma has in it something that's not pure seichel. Again, I go back to what I said before. When a scientist or person with intelligence comes to a point where they realize that intelligence itself is rooted in something that's beyond intelligence, then you start dealing with a real connection between science and faith, or science and reason. Reason and the divine, etc., etc. Okay. What was felt there in Chochma? There nirgish, he felt the atzmus hamuskel, the essence of the idea. And because of the etzem hamuskel, the essence of the seichel, which clearly he's making the case here that it's not pure seichel. The essence of the seichel, That's what made him Nas Yashiv. That's what caused him to cause it to be Nas Yashiv, internalized or convinced that this is the resonating, convinced and resonate of this resonating truth. He's explaining it further. And afterwards, when he began to comprehend this idea, the essence of the seichel was concealed. He's now connecting it to what he said at the end of the last chapter. Last chapter, he brought into a picture that there's the etzem of a seichel, which is Ayin Chochma, and there's the pashtus of it, the extension of it as it's expressed in binah. Now he's adding the hanocha concept. So he's saying that this hanocha, this resonant element, when it comes now into comprehension, the essence of the seichel, of the idea, of the concept, is concealed. And what radiates, actually he's not even talking here binah, I'm sorry. He's talking about even in Chochma itself, the outer part of Chochma, what we have now, is only the outer part of it, only the seichel, the intelligence part, the intelligent element of it. In other words, and maybe he'll explain this, but to think about it, let's talk about the scenario. What would be if Chochma didn't have hanocha? So you could have an intelligent idea, you never know for sure it's correct. That sense of satisfaction, of epiphany, of resonance, of realization that something is correct, is that a logical thing, or is that beyond logic? Now it's clear, he makes it clear, we're not talking about an emotional reaction. We're not talking about the feelings that are born from seichel, like he spoke earlier, that you get excited about it. That's already an emotion, that's a result. We're talking about, in the intelligence idea, that type of conviction, that you're convinced in your mind. I'm not talking about akshanis, we're not talking about abstinence, we're not talking about subjective reasons, we're not talking about you're convinced for some ulterior motive. We're talking about pure intellectual conviction. Conviction. It's a good word here also. Where does that come from? So he's saying that comes from sensing the essence of the seichel that's beyond pure comprehension. So you, both of us can both share an idea, and I can be convinced and you're not. Not that you say it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to you. But you don't have quite the conviction that another person may have. What's lacking? Not saying that you won't get to it. So conviction is that type of thing. When the Rebbe Rashab said to Reb Chaim that this is how he sensed it, that was a conviction. It was hanocha. He just knew that. He knew something's wrong. What? I can't explain what it is. Now, of course, as I said, many people are convinced of things that are not necessarily accurate. But a person who has a trained person, a person who you can trust, just senses. I remember once talking to a doctor who was dealing with fertility matters. And I sent someone to see him. So he says he just senses something. So I said, based on what? He said, I can't tell you, just from my years of experience. So there, I don't know if it's Chochma, there you could say it's the opposite. It's the accumulation of knowledge, of experience. You just have a certain, you know things that there's someone that doesn't have it. But I could also see someone has an instinct, an intellectual instinct, where, and again, I'm not talking about pure intuition, intellectual instinct, where they have that, some people just have a sense of something, and they know that's...
Probably you can train yourself to get to open these channels,
Yeah, but only after you know what these channels are like. The biggest training is bittul. Well, as soon as you get yourself out of the way, you generally a lot of channels open up. If you're too addicted to getting the channels open, I remember once a guy came to me, and years ago I was at a wedding, it was in Minnesota, and he said, I heard that when you study Chassidus, it opens up channels and so on and so forth. And I saw he wanted it so much, I said, it's not going to work for you. Because you have to get yourself out of the way. It can't be, I'm going to learn it, and where are the results? I want to have immediately, I want to see my channels opening. Because you're not doing it for that purpose. The whole point of it, so bittul is one of the key things that Chochma has, to move yourself aside and then things enter. Okay, but in the seichel of it, when you talk already now the comprehension part, not you don't have that conviction. It's not misyashav adayin. It's not yet. You're not yet convinced. You're not yet internalized. It's not yet integrated to the point where that's correct. Where you can say that's correct. Here we go. And the eitzah is, what's the eitzah? What's the advice to get to that type of conviction? Is that he should bind himself. He should connect himself again Es soll sich zutragen. He should bring himself closer, literally what it means, but zutragen is more than that. He should pay attention. He should say, zutragen, concentrate, but more than that, it's like hiskashrus, where you actually what's the word? I don't want to say surrender, but you commit. Zutragen, you commit, you get to the things, to the depth and the internal dimension of this concept, as it was by him when he first had initial resonating hanocha. From the minyan, that he should feel more, not the seichel, not the logic of it, but the hanocha, the resonance of it. The lake from the minyan, the inyan lake. This is very powerful stuff here. He's basically giving an eitzah here. So in other words, when a person is two people, let's say, having a discussion, they can be focusing on pure intelligence, like, the mathematics of it, let's say. Mathematics, the mechanics. 2 + 2 is 4. This makes sense. It doesn't make sense. And you know yourself, you can get into a whole discussion on that and miss the point. You can miss the point. Not that I'm not talking about you're not having a rational conversation, but you're missing the bottom line, the punchline, or the hanocha. What's the thing that you get out of the whole picture? Right. So you see this many times, especially people who are immature or less experienced. Their minds work very well, but they lack of ability. There's certain, like say you challenge them and say, okay, so you're having this argument. My binah, what difference does it make? It almost doesn't matter to them what difference does it make. But that's critical. I'm just giving an example. That would help crystallize. Let's get beyond that. Let's get to what's the bottom line. Let's see what the litmus test of this idea is. I mean, just giving an example. He's not saying this exactly here. The point is, he's giving an eitzah how to get back to that hanocha sichlis when you're not feeling it. You're sensing more the seichel. The point here is that clearly, even in the world of intelligence that we worship so much as being objective knowledge, there's an element of conviction. There's an element of. They asked this guy, Higgs. He was there when they made the presentation. So they asked him, do you think this is what you were... He predicted the discovery of this particle. He didn't see it ever. He predicted, based on calculations, he predicted. So he had like a sense. He had a hanocha. Like, it's going to be there. So they asked him, so he said, yeah, it's most likely it. Not that he's the final say, but there's something about a person who, let's say, does research, and there's leitzach, he says, I can't prove it. I'm not sure, but I just sense there's something there. When they asked Stephen Hawking about it, he probably made a bet saying that they'll never discover it.
Boson figured it out 80 years ago.
They'll never discover this particle.
Boson did it 80 years ago.
Let's put it this way. El Terech Siddim would say, what they discovered in Higgs boson, we already knew 4,000 years ago, and we're waiting for them to discover the real thing. So, the ganze Welt macht Ruhaf or something that... we have to see hashgacha pratis. I look at it like opportunity. If people get people's attention, maybe we can try to convince them that there's more to coming. That's the bottom line.
Never make a whole thing about it.
Lav dafka.
It's the old ethos.
I can't say it wouldn't, because if the Rebbe would sense that it was something that was leading, I could see the Rebbe using it as an opportunity to show that there's always more to know, like that. I don't know if this per se. The Rebbe writes in a letter in Ayin Beis. They asked him why he doesn't make a big fuss about landing on the moon. Very interesting letter.
This is not sure if it really happened.
No, you're into conspiracy theories. The Rebbe writes the exact opposite. The Rebbe writes, anyone who knows science knows that in the beginning of the 20th century, the theory was possible. It's just a matter of creating the equipment, the concept to land on the moon. The Rebbe said, if you want something revolutionary, look at he writes about the theory of relativity. Einstein and quantum mechanics, he alludes to. That, he says, was something that was not predictable. That's like a real chiddush. So landing on the moon was just a matter of the concept was there. They didn't have yet the way to do it. So the Rebbe says, right, it's beferish. So therefore, it's not, the Rebbe is not expelled from a concept that was there. It's a matter of time. But certain ideas are completely radical. Well, look, discussing this in detail, this to me is no question. This has a lot of implications. I'd love to compare this to how, you have cognitive scientists and cognitive psychologists that deal with the workings of the mind and so on. This is pretty mind-blowing stuff. There's nothing to talk about. How because he's dissecting now these two elements in intelligence. So the eitzah is to reconnect ourselves, to connect yourself again to the pnimika in hanocha sichlis. V'hu sheyurgesh yeser hanocha sichlis, you should feel more this resonance, this conviction. The lake from the minyan. I think conviction is a good word. Lake, conviction. It's a lake tzarvamir. I have a conviction about it. I feel it's not just a theory. Now, you can have a good example would be like, say, as I said before. Let's say you have two theories on the table. You can say, I like this theory more, or this theory makes more sense to me. This still doesn't mean you're convinced. You bring me enough evidence, but then there comes a point of conviction where you're convinced. Again, I want to dispel. I'm not talking about someone who's convinced to the point of abstinence, and then if he hears new facts, he's not going to change it. We're talking about a conviction that's coming from a very pure and powerful place. And this gives power. This empowers. Increasingly empowers the sichli, the intelligence of. By reconnecting, by revisiting, by to connect itself again back to that initial resonating truth, that was the conviction element. This in turn gives power, increasing power, to the seichel of it, to the concept, to the logic of it. He's adding a new point here. And it comes down into the comprehension of binah, to comprehend everything that you're capable of comprehending in this subject. So you have now another key point here. Not just that you get a certain conviction, but your seichel becomes better as a result. So we said there's two elements to seichel. There's the logic of it, like I said, the mathematics of it, the mechanics, the details. When you connect to the hanocha, and then there's the conviction. The conviction then in turn empowers and gives more power to the seichel to come up with more ideas that will explain this idea. As it's known in the idea of riyah de chochma, the vision of chochma. That in this radiates the essence of the subject that's higher completely than comprehension. Nevertheless, even though it's higher than comprehension, it in turn gives power, it increases additional power into the seichel and the ideas, that there should be an intensified flowings of intelligence. So in other words, it's not two separate worlds, where you have a certain conviction and resonance, and then you have the intelligent part, the ideas. He's actually saying that even though one of them is higher than seichel, he's going back almost and showing that it's not completely outside of the realm of seichel, even though it's fundamentally something that's beyond logic, beyond reason, but in turn empowers reason. That when you have that, it opens up the channels. So let's say, for example, you're as I said, we had a problem, and you were trying to resolve it. Someone comes up with an idea. Okay. You start fleshing out the idea, you lose that sense of resonance. But if you connect to it again, what happens is, it starts opening up channels. You start thinking, because when you're convinced of something, it makes your mind work stronger to make a case for it. Again, I'm not talking about distorted case. We're talking about a legitimate case. That's what he's saying here. Like it says in Priyat Chaim about the Arizal, Shebeshinus Sarayim, the Shabbos Kedesh, Bro, b'parsha bolak, ubila masho yitzorach l'daber b'zeh peishona. This is brought in many places. So the Eitz Chaim says, Priyat Chaim brings an interesting thing. Priyat Chaim is one of the works of the Arizal. It's written by Rabbi Chaim Vital. Priyat Chaim is more kavonis, like intentions of davening and mitzvahs and so on, as opposed to Eitz Chaim, which is more like the cosmic order. Eitz Chaim is like a scholar. Priyat Chaim is avoid, if you want to put it that way. But avoid for Mukabalim. So he says that Rizal once while he was sleeping, he took a nap on Shabbos, Shinas Tzarayim, which is in the afternoon. He saw in his vision, a vision on the Pasha Bolak and Bilam, which is actually last week's Pashim, what did he see? He saw something that would take 80 years to speak out. And even with 80 years, it doesn't say that. Remember that Rizal only lived till 37 and a half, so it obviously didn't have 80 years to talk about it. So saying that this type of thing he saw would take 80 years if you had to explain it. He's saying, and even with 80 years, he could not reveal what he actually saw. Because seeing something is the essence of the entity, the essential personality of the entity, that does not come into comprehension at all. Like I mentioned the example, go tell someone who's never seen colors what colors are. You can speak 80 years and it won't help. You can explain the feeling you have with colors. You can say blue makes you feel this way, red this way. Colors, combination, create beauty. You can give examples. But there's something the person who's never seen it can never get. But now he's going back. Remember, he wants to say not just separate, but it also, on the other hand, it empowers seichel. Only thing is through seeing the essence of something. Also, the haskalah, the intelligence of it, will be beribui, expanded or expansive or broadened out, and very deep. Pedic, as he says in the bottom, Reish Samach Zayin 267. So clearly something there that we have to look at. So that Rizal, does it bring proof to both sides? I thought he was first saying that it adds seichel. Yeah, I think so. Because on one hand, clearly seeing something is beyond seichel, and that's why it takes so many years, and even with all those years, he still could not fully express it. On the other hand, you're not spelling it out, but on the other hand, the fact is that it would empower a person to speak a lot and communicate a lot in the comprehension of the thing because he saw it. Even though he may never end up giving you the full picture, but as a result of this vision that Rizal had, because why is it important to say that he would speak 80 years?
He never spoke it out.
It doesn't matter, but it means that it could be that 80 years would ultimately, in other words, it has the ability to be spoken and spoken and spoken. If he never saw it, he wouldn't speak about it at all.
Because he gave him material to talk about. Basically, that's what it means.
Yeah, but why 80, not 90? Why don't you say it can't take 80 years? It can take an infinite amount of years. What he's trying to say is that it does create a flow of seichel to speak about.
Yeah, it creates material to talk about.
Exactly. So, but that's what he wanted to prove. That riyah, that touch of the etzem seichel hanocha, opens up new channels of communication. That's all he's saying.
Yeah, the more a person knows, the more he has material to talk about. It's not only the riyah part.
Are you asking, or I'm explaining what he said here.
Yeah, I'm asking.
Why is that a question? No, because he's trying to point out here that you could have an experience that's fundamental, like Chochma, higher than Seichel, but will cause binah to suddenly.
The more intimate experiences, the more you can.
But not just the more. It does translate into abundance of a flow of ideas, of concepts, of explanations. Even if it doesn't completely.
Maybe you can cover it from all angles.
That's what he said. He said. It gives you boli de asog the bin lahasik kol ma she'efshel lahasik ba'inyan.
So any hanocha has the same thing, though, right? Any hanocha can't be completely done with binah.
Completely what? Can't be comprehended completely. Binah will never fully get.
There's no steer. Exactly the same thing.
Look. There's a few things he said here. First thing he says that Chochma is this concept. The next thing he says this hanocha is higher essentially than Seichel itself. Right? And when it finally comes into intelligence, it doesn't have that same certitude.
That is also wasn't hanocha; it was actually a riyah.
Yeah, but it's the same thing.
But that's
Nobody kept on making the case before that it's not the same thing.
But in this case,
now he's bringing it back. He's giving an example from riyah. Yeah.
In this dimension, it's the same.
Yeah. Before he said it, even without riyah, there's hanocha. Even without a riyah, now he's going and he's saying kaneda. Giving an example. One second. So the second thing was that binah is removed from that, and the eitzah, the solution to get binah, to have that sense of certitude. That's another word, certitude, like conviction. Certitude is another word in English. Certainty, certitude. Yeah. The answer for that is to reconnect to that. Then he's added something else. That by that certitude, that conviction, actually opens up channels of comprehension, even on the level of seichel. And he brings a proof for it, because you see that there's something that he gives. He says, he's going back now to Riyah de Chochma. That even though it's higher than comprehension, it opens up channels and flow of intelligence.
The same way hanocha.
Exactly. And from that, we know also for the hanocha, he's going to conclude. I was going to say this. We're going to read now. He gave an example from Riyah of Chochma. Before he said hanocha is lower than Riyah. But now he's going back. But he's saying that hanocha gives power to the intelligence, like we see with Riyah, with seeing that Rizal saw when he saw the Parsha Balak and Bilam, that takes 80 years. So you see from this that there's something higher, but it creates a flow. Well, in other words, the explanation Chassidus is giving in 80 years is, why is this Priyatz Chaim saying that? Why doesn't he just say that he saw something that can't be explained? If you want to express that. He's saying no. It could be explained, it takes 80 years. So it's telling you two things. That is beyond comprehension a certain way. And even after 80 years, it's still beyond, but still, it causes a person to begin to communicate. It's not just a private little experience. It will open up channels that will continue to flow and flow and flow. Well, Kamoi Kain, then he says like this. Kamoi Kain hanocha sichlis ube'etzem l'mayla misog. The same thing with the hanocha sichlis, the leg, the resonance, the conviction. In Seichel, hu be'etzem l'mayla masog. It's higher than comprehension, like Riyah. Ki hanocha sichlis hu kamoi Riyah de Chochma, kamoi hariyah de Chochma. Here he spells it out exactly. Because it's hanocha sichlis, that leg, that conviction in Seichel, is like the side of Chochma, but actually b'madrega tachtenim imena. Like you said right at the beginning of the chapter. The only thing is, it's a lower level within it. But it's similar to it. I'll try to explain what difference in a moment. Let's see what he says here. Why is it lower? Because seeing something is completely higher than Seichel. I guess the Rebbe Rashab sense that we need this explanation here. So now in the parentheses, yes. Hagam shezeh ma shebe'ein haseichel shebe'ein haseichel debelipcha. Is that a lashon somewhere? Ein haseichel debelipcha? Okay. I mean, Pashas, it means belipcha, in the heart. Okay. So he's saying, he's now explaining.
It's not really
right. He's saying parenthetically here that just like Riyah works this way, that it's higher than Seichel, higher than a comprehension, then it comes down and it empowers comprehension. Same thing on Chochma. Even though, more specifically, the conviction and intelligent conviction of something is lower than Riyah, because Riyah is completely higher than Seichel. So in the parentheses he says that even though Riyah seeing is what it means seeing, it means that the sight doesn't mean physically seeing, it means the sight of the eye and the mind, like Chacham Einav Bereisheh. What's the end of that pasuk? Chacham Einav Bereisheh? It's a Mishle, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is with the Ayin HaSeichel the Belipcha. This is talking about, he's not talking about actually seeing, he's talking about how the intelligence sees something, you're certain Chochma, like it sees something, he says the Belipcha, like in your heart. But in the future, it'll be actual sight, like the sight of the eye. In other words, actually almost like exactly like we see with our eyes. Doesn't say like it says that we will eye to eye, we will see eye to eye with God. Like it says elsewhere. He's just qualifying that he's just saying Riyah is higher than Seichel, even though Riyah is also Ayin HaSeichel, he says, but law say they'll actually be seeing it physically, like we see physically.
It'll be translated into a saga and to go down to all the other levels in a complete clear picture. He
didn't say that yet. 1 second. Whereas hanocha sichlis, that conviction in the mind, is an intelligent element. It's not completely higher than intelligence. The only thing is the primary element is not the logic of it, but the conviction of it. Basically, he's saying there are three levels here. There's a level of riyah, which is higher than seichel. You just see something and there's a certain truth in seeing something, a certain resonance.
It's in the heart. That's what he's qualifying.
Or ayin seichel, yeah. But it is compared to the asad lavi when you'll actually see it. So it's higher. Then comes hanocha. Hanocha is the conviction within seichel. And then there's the logic within seichel, the logic of it, the mathematics of it, the details. Now he's going back. So this was somewhat of like I can't say tangent, it was almost like a parenthesis, abbreviated.
It's all within Chochma.
Yeah, he's saying, just like riyah is higher, and it empowers seichel and opens up channels, now he's going the same thing. So you have to read it like this. Even though hanocha sichlis, which is higher than sog, even though it's not as high as riyah, it's still higher. Now he continues. And this adds and intensifies power in the intelligence, which is what is comprehended within binah. He's giving now another example. Like we find that there are many very profound ideas, and wondrous, profound and awesome ideas. They're higher than comprehension. Nevertheless, there's a room for them in seichel and intelligence by wise people. In other words, wise people have a certain sense, certain ideas that are profound and very wondrous and awesome, and they come into form some type of seichel. This is the in-between stage. It's not the riyah de chochma where you actually see something and there's a certain truth in the seeing. It's also not binah, comprehension. So it's something in between. Because these ideas are not on the level of seeing. And also, besides the fact that they're not riyah, they also and we also know that it's not riyah, it's not like seeing it because they have room. They can be proven, and they're not logical conclusions, but there's space for them in seichel. In other words, it's not based on faith, and it's not based on some other force. It's a intellectual intuition, essentially. So it's seichel, but it's not riyah, it's not seeing it, but it's not also completely logical either.
It's like you can identify something in a picture of, is that type of level?
It's a certain intellectual conviction about certain things that are very profound, that are not because you saw it. Sometimes you see something, you may not understand it, but it's true, you just saw it. Here it's not through the sight, there it's something that is comprehended. So the Gam Dezeh Sheyesh they have place Mokum B'Seichel. It means like this: Seichel doesn't contradict, intelligence doesn't contradict it, but it's not purely driven by a logical formula. That's what he's saying here. And not that it's just because I saw it, that's why I know it's true. Rather, this is coming from the hanocha sichlis, the resonating conviction, intelligent conviction of Chochma. Even though this is an intelligence, it's going back again. Even though we're talking now intelligence, his primary personality, his primary form is hanocha. It's that conviction, not its comprehension. And that's why there can be room there, even for things that are higher than comprehension. You have this, when you read about the quantum mechanic developments and Einstein's theories, before he developed the theory, before he wrote the theory of relativity, theory of special relativity, you see in his notes, and you see in different things that he wrote and communicated, he already had a sense of something. That was, if he said it to anybody, even after he wrote it, it was seen as not making sense. The fact that he said that time is relative, that light can be bent, etc. There were things that he sensed. He said, he came up with a concept. He was dreaming. He was dreaming out of the box, basically. And he came up with a sense. Now, it wasn't like a vision of Yechezkel. He saw a chariot in heaven, or he saw God and he knew it was true, or he saw beauty. It was a logical thing. He was developing a scientific theory. At that point, it wasn't yet a theory that could be put into a formula. It couldn't be tested. You couldn't experiment with it. But he had a sense intellectual. So it's something very profound, as mokim b'seichel. But its primary driving force is not the logic yet. It's the sense, the conviction that something is like that. Like observing and saying, there must be something there. Then comes a level where you actually begin to flesh it out. And then you don't have that conviction anymore. It says, unless you reconnect. That's what he's adding here. So before, when he's talking about hanocha, he didn't really use this example. This is a new example that he's adding, that you see by chachamim, by intelligent people who have brilliant ideas, that are not seichel, but you can't call them pure logic either. It's an in-between place. I think it's understandable. So even though it's sichli, ikr is hanocha. So you see this subtle place where Chochma plays. He's adding a whole dimension to a certain resonance and intelligence, conviction that exists out there. I would love to see what this is called by these cognitive thinkers, the ones who think, how ideas come into play and so on. They must have a name for this. And this goes back to what he said. And through this, because there's such a brilliant concept, they have the ability to bring these ideas into comprehension. So in other words, after Einstein came up with his conviction, then he sat down and it opened up channels for him to figure out how to prove it, how to communicate it, how to turn it into an algorithm. Yeah, for sure. I'm looking for examples of my own. Sometimes, you have a certain resonating point comes up, and you don't yet necessarily have words for it, but you have the point, and then you begin to write it up and develop it until you can explain it and make a case for it. And this is what Chochma is called the level of Das Elyon. Das Elyon, Das Tachten, is based on the pasuk in Shmuel. There's a lashon there, alilis kanu alilis. You know the lashon? Kel deis havaya. Kanu alilis, I think. Kel deis havaya. So the Zohar says, Kel deis, what's deis? Plural. It says there's Das Elyon and Das Tachten. I think the first time we ever mentioned it here in this Hamshah, right? So Das Elyon is basically this perspective from above, how God sees things. Das Tachten, how we see things from the perspective from below. So now he's saying Chochma is the level of Das Elyon. I mean, you could really actually start a new paragraph here if you want to really, because now he's explaining now. Remember, all this came to answer the question, which I believe he answered. Isn't Chochma Yediyah Sichlis? So how could we say Chochma is fundamentally a different dimension? And remember, all this is coming to explain space, conceptual space. But as I said, you can see clearly this is not just about conceptual space, it's about the interface as well. It's very, very clear. Because it's almost the same words that he used before about Atzilus, and so on. So what we have is like this. So now he answered the question that Chochma is basically two opposites. It's Seichel, but it's higher than Seichel. It's not the higher than the Seichel of Riyah of Chochma, which is because you see something, you know it's truth. It's definitely not the higher Seichel that he said before, if you remember a few chapters before he spoke about, on top of page 66, where there's no reason at all. Emunah. There's Mesiras Nefesh. There's no Yediyah altogether. We're not talking about just a desire or a connection based on something that is not logical. Here we're talking in the world of cognitive. He's introducing another dimension which is called Chochma. So it's not just diminished binah, or binah is diminished Chochma, however you want to call it. Meaning it's not just the same, it's not of the same matter. Chochma has in it a certain type of conviction as well. Hanocha he called it. He called it also a form of syashvus. So now he goes back and says, okay, so this Chochma, this is what Chochma is das elyon, which clearly tells you it's a different category, meaning that binah is das tachten. So these are not just these are not two stages of one level. These are very different levels. Because the Chochma radiates the infinite divine light, the yesh amiti, the ultimate essence of God. That means the level of atzmus, the essence, which is the level of yesh amiti. Yesh amiti is the word we use when we say, we think we're it, the real it. Who's the real it? Atzmus. And that what is below, which means that which we can that comes down in comprehension. This is only merely a reflection. This is from this perspective of das elyon. That's the yesh amiti. And the ayin is what's lower. Well, anything that's a reflection is nothing. Is ayin is considered like nothingness. It's completely nullified. Completely nullified. Kalo chashiv, like not like kalo means like kiloi, kamoiloi. Kalo, it's like doesn't exist compared to it. Now he's making a qualification in the parentheses. So this is Chochma. So Chochma is das elyon because from the perspective of this type of conviction, that which comes as a reflection is like nothing. Is weak. Is almost insignificant. Qualification he's making is like this. This is not like it says elsewhere. The b'chinas das elyon, the Chochma rak masha b'Chochma musig hadei elyena. He's saying something more. It's not what it says elsewhere that the das elyon, the higher perspective of Chochma. What does that mean? That in Chochma, the musig hadei elyena, Chochma comprehends the higher perspective. Chochma comprehends how the Ein Sof, the divine essence, the divine is the real yesh, and everything is nullified compared to it. Because according to that explanation, then Chochma is not the yesh. Chochma recognizes it. Elsewhere it's explained, Chochma is only a reflection. Being that it's a reflection that's bound and connected to its source, therefore, because Chochma is bittul, therefore it comprehends and senses how that Ein Sof, the infinite divine, is the true itness, and everything else is insignificant compared to it. And through Chochma, understanding and appreciating this Chochma itself is in a form of bittul, kala chashiv, of self-worthlessness or insignificance. This is the bittul of the higher Yechudi Allah. Like das elyon, das tachten, Yechudi Allah is essentially the bittul that comes from das elyon, and Yechudi Allah is the bittul that comes from das tachten. Yechudi Allah is like saying nothing exists. Only godliness. Yechud Tata is saying it exists, but it's bittul hayesh, like it's only compared to something higher. It's nullified. But this all is still not what he's saying here. Elsewhere, he's basically saying the explanation is Chochma is not that Chochma is das elyon. I'm sorry. No. Chochma is das elyon in both places, but the meaning there is that Chochma appreciates that the divine is the essence and the real yesh, and everything else is nullified. And that way, Chochma has bittul. But lofia mavur kam, but according to what we just learned here, we discussed here, who the b'chochma meir Ein Sof b'chinas yesh amiti. Not that Chochma only senses that there's a yesh amiti out there. That the Chochma radiates this essence, the yesh amiti, the real itness of the divine. The true itness, the true essence. So in other words, he's explaining how, according to here, Chochma is higher even. There, Chochma, you can say, is more seichel, but it's a seichel that's very subtle and refined and has bittul. And as such, it recognizes something beyond, it recognizes that everything is nullified. Here he's saying, in Chochma radiates the etzem itself, and according to this way, everything that is called intelligence and comprehension is insignificant. In the first way, it's not insignificant because Chochma itself is seichel, but it's a seichel that appreciates something that's higher. Here, seichel itself is in a way beyond seichel, basically, I'm saying Chochma itself is that which is beyond seichel. You understand the distinction between the two places? Basically, two ways of explaining Chochma as Das Elyon. Obviously, in the interface, as we see, this is very consistent to the Ayin Beis in general, because Ayin Beis is trying to connect us deeper and deeper to the source. The first explanation elsewhere, then basically Chochma senses something beyond there, but it can't enter there. Here, the fact that we have a conviction in Seichel means we can actually enter into Atzmus. It makes the interface closer because it means Atzmus actually manifests in Chochma, not just Chochma recognizes it. I think it's a critical chiddush here.
It's the Atzmus that we always talk about. It's the Atzmus of the Mailam.
Look, we're not talking about Atzmus. We're talking about, Yeshamiti. We're talking about Yeshamiti. Bottom line is, I'll tell you the differences. One is Seichel appreciates that which is beyond Seichel, and one is that Seichel is really beyond Seichel, just masquerading as Seichel. That's Chochma. That's the real difference. If you want to really put it down.
It's an interface, as both.
Correct. No, it's not a contradiction. Look, elsewhere he's explaining, he's just making a comparison. The Hezbollah Tutzeldah. So not just that Seichel is Mechayev higher than Seichel, the truth is Seichel is also beyond. And we see it in the conviction element. This is extremely relevant later in the interface when he talks about Chochma Stima. This is going to play itself out big time as he develops this idea. Wild stuff, Doctor. It is.
There's a core component in the whole
Technically, you could just say it's all an explanation of Chochma binah as Ma'alamata, technically. But in truth, it's a very core. It's clearly that. You can see the elaboration is more than just a Maimer HaMuzgan as an example to explain Ma'alamata. It's very, very clear. Look, he's going to let's sum it up. Let's see. In other words, not Chabad is not Seichel trying to understand the divine. People say Chassidei Chabad, Chassidei Chagas. Chagas, they work more with emotions, with ritual, with simcha, behavior. It's Kashrus to Rebbe. Chabad, versteht. Come to learn, understand. The truth is, that's not the Vort. The Vort is the opposite. In Chabad, Seichel, Elikus is Malbish also. Even Seichel could be a Keli to Elikus.
The Vort is connection. Chassidei Chagas try to connect to God, to the divine, through the emotion, right? And we try to connect to the divine through our intelligence.
That's the Pashut explanation. I'm trying to say is that it's a lot deeper than that. It's saying that God, Seichel is really a Elikus Malbish in a Levush called Seichel. It's not Seichel trying to understand the Elikus.
That's why we chose Chabad over Chagas, because
exactly, because God created an intelligent universe that means godliness manifests in Seichel. I'm saying it's much deeper. It's not like two alternative ways. One is, you have two options. You can either connect to God through emotions and not use your seichel, but not your seichel in hasogas alakus. Break your head to understand godliness. Another is, we use our heads also. That's mamat lamayla, two approaches. The fact that God, the truth is that the God that created Ishtalshus created Chochma binah das. Chochma binah das is elikus. That's Chochma, is divine Chochma that dressed itself up in Seichel. It's the same God that you have in Kabbalah Sale and you have in Midas and everything.
But there's also the divine in Chagas.
There's divine in Chagas, but Seichel has, as he says, Chochma has a divine that Chagas never will have. Remember we said earlier that Chochma is made b'kiruv and binah b'richuk and zoh like a chalein. Midas, because they have yesh involved, because it's me feeling something, there's not a keli for it. Chochma becomes the deepest keli for godliness. I'm just throwing that out as a critical point here. Now we go, okay. So this is what he explains according to here.
The connection to God is a deeper level when we use our intelligence.
That's the first simple explanation.
Because of over there radiates a higher intensity of godliness in intelligence. That's basically what he's saying.
I just gave you two ways to explain what Chabad is, and I'm saying is that it's not the first way. The first way is that we're using seichel also to understand. Not only are we connecting to God through our emotions, we're also connecting through our intelligence. I'm saying here is that seichel, Chochma shows that elokus really, Chochma, intelligence itself is really elokus.
That's exactly. The connection is more profound, it's more deeper.
Yeah. And Chochma actually experiences that divine yesh amiti, not just understands that it's there.
Because it's less yesh, it's less mugdal.
No, you could still say that it only can relate to it. Doesn't mean that it is it. He's saying he said that b'mokamacher he explains that it only sees it, it comprehends it, but it's not it. It only is bottled to it. Here he says that's actually it. That's what he just said here. And now he continues. He's talking about Dasa of Chochma. And when Chochma, when the transmission of Chochma transmits and enters into binah, then that's when Hashpah of Chochma is called Ayin. He's going back to Yeshma and Ayin of Chochma binah. So from the Chochma's perspective, the Yesh, it's Yesh. It is the Yesh. And Binah is Ayin. But when it comes now into Binah, from Binah's perspective, the Ayin is now Chochma. And what is that? The hanocha sichlis. Because Binah can only relate to the concept, to the comprehension of the concept, like I said, to the mathematics, to the logic of it. It doesn't relate to the conviction of it. The mashamusik b'binu rak because what's understood in bina is only the external part of the seichel. The hainu asichli shebenekudas haskola. So in the nekuda of chochma, basically you have two parts. You have the conviction of it because it senses its source. It's connected to its source, so it's a conviction. That's why you're so sure. That's why you have the surety, the certitude. And there's another part in this spark of chochma, which is the seichel of it, that results from that certitude, which is the logic of it. And Bina only relates to that part of the second part, the intelligence within the nekuda, within the spark, within the point. But the upleg, the conviction, the resonance, that's in the essence of the point of the intelligence. That's an ayin. It's like an unknown. I don't know what that is. Ayin. Which means it's a concealed state that's not comprehended in Bina. So when the person who only has, let's say, Bina, not Chochma, will say, how are you so sure? You say, I'm sure. How are you so sure? Bina cannot come to it unless, as he said, you return to, you get to that point where you can actually explain it to the point of that type of certainty. But how are you so sure? Nevertheless, now he's going back. So now that we established Chochma is a different entity. But this entity, as we said before, also empowers Bina. So now it goes back, right? We said it makes a flow of intelligence. But nevertheless, even though Chochma is higher fundamentally than comprehension, as you just elaborated, nevertheless, this is the primary source and cause for the comprehension of Bina. Ukanal the hanocha sichlis nitno neshenes keyach ba'asaga. Like we said earlier, we spoke about that result, that the hanocha sichlis, this resonance, this conviction, gives power into comprehension. I mean, see, practically, a person who's convinced of something, let's say they come to you have a problem, you came to an idea. You'll spend all night and all day, now you're motivated, because you say, I know that it's correct, and now I want to demonstrate it. So you're going to spend overtime and it's going to be a flow of intelligence coming out of it. The be'em is b'chol haskola chadasha, k'meishi b'nekudis haskola. In the parentheses, yes, in truth, every new concept, every new idea, k'meishi b'nekudis haskola, as it is in the nekuda, in the point, ikra b'chinas hanocha. Its primary element there is an upleg, is the resonance, is the conviction. And that precisely is the cause of the intelligence and the comprehension. He's adding now. The truth is, every idea works that way, but it's more obvious. It's increasingly more obvious when you're dealing with the profound, the emek, the depth and inner dimension of a seichel canal, like he spoke about the Chochamim.
How do you finish?
Hold on. He's saying every idea.
Transcendent.
You mean a divine idea, maybe?
Any idea.
No, he's saying every idea. It means even a scientific idea. The concept. We're talking about the Chochma part of it.
Yes.
Is a hanocha. It's primarily a conviction. But when it comes to our Eza Emek Primis, I mean, the word Emek Primis, he began looking, if you look at the top of the page, Ayin Beis, he's used the words, Emek Primis Ayin. Basically, he's saying even when you have a superficial idea that comes to your mind, meaning, not let's say a big problem that you're going to dig deep. Let's say you just, an idea falls into your mind. There too, this really conviction is the key element, and then it comes into seichel. But it's even more obvious when it comes to a very deep idea, because something you struggled with, let's say, a real dilemma, and you come to a depth of it, there it's even obvious. Or the story with Arizal, where he saw something so profound. My point is that he's just saying, he's just qualifying, he's just trying to explain that you have...
Ayin Beis.
V'zehu sha'chochma nikra there's Kodesh and Kadesh. Huh? V'zehu sha'chochma nikra Kadesh. Huh?
Kadesh Mila B'Gamei.
Yeah, Kadesh Mila B'Gamei without a vav.
Yes.
Then there's Kodesh. So you pronounce I've always wondered, sometimes you pronounce say Kodesh, and how do you say Kodesh with a vav, Kodesh without? Say Kadesh and Kodesh, or you both Kodesh? Kodesh and Kodesh.
Kadosh.
So the vav after, like it's like a kilo of vav, like a malup, like a chelam after the kuf, or it's after the dal. Okay, Kodesh or Kodesh? I think so. I think you're right. Kodesh. Yeah. So Kodesh. This is the level where Chochma is called Kodesh. Commission Shmat Misashab is Kodesh, Kodeshi. Kodesh, meaning kuf, what's the chelam after the kuf Kodesh. Kodesh would be kuf daled, and then Kodesh, the vav is as the chelam in it.
What does it mean differently?
Kodesh Mila B'Gamei means when something's on its own. He's going to explain it's a completely separate entity. Kodesh is ready when it's hamshachah, the vav. He's saying something, sanctify something. There's the sanctification of something, turning it, sanctifying it. There's something that is fundamentally sacred. Shemat is Shabbos ki Kodeshu. He protect the Shabbos because it's holy. What is Kodesh? So if you do it, the Shabbos will gili meichen Abba. It's known Shabbos is the revelation of meichen Abba. We spoke about that, higher than Ishtalshus, Chochma. Ve'isa b'zeir, and it says in Zeir Kodesh hu mila b'garmei. Kodesh is a word that stands on its own. When you say, for example, the word Kodesh, you have to say something is Kodesh. This thing is holy. When you see Kodesh, it's like a word, a level that stands on its own. The Pirish Kodesh hu hayeshe muvdal. Because Kodesh means that it's separate from muvdal. Or kamash'in havdalah hu she'ena misaravim dugmasei. Like the inyan of Avdallah, when you separate one thing from another, it means that you're not mixing. One thing is not mixing with something that's similar to it. Even with the thing that may seem and appear that it's similar, similar to synonymous with it, or b'dei love, or similar to it. When you say something is separate from something, to say something is, let's say, to say that the 2 + 2 is 4 is separate from apples and oranges, you call it Avdollah, not in the same world. You don't need to separate them. Something that is separate from something that's completely not in proportionate in the same world, it's not a separation. Like we can't say that a person is separate from an animal. It's not in the same category, not in the same league. When can you say Avdallah is, rather when you say something is separate from something that's proportionate, commensurate. So you could say one thing is separate from another. U'kumesh k'she'imrim ala chacham, shul chacham gadol, ba'aflo v'avdola. Like when you say in a wise person that he's a brilliant chacham, ba'aflo, awesome, wondrous, v'avdola, and separate. And shul muvdal gam ha'chachamim. So you say chacham gadol, ba'aflo, ba'avdola, that even from other wise people, he's beyond them. So they're at least in the same league. They're all talking about chachamim.
We're talking about the Eibishter. I mean, how does that?
Well, let's finish 1 second. He's discussing it. To say that a person is brilliant and say he's separate from simple people, it's not capable of saying he's separate. They're not at all in the same league. They're not from the same erech. They're not in the same proportion. Same personality at all. He's adding b'muhus seichel. He's not trying to say they don't have any qualities. In seichel, right? In seichel, they're not chachamim. This is a scholar. You're talking about a sage. Ki'im. Where could you say Abdullah? Rather, chacham that have that at least in the same league, they're intelligent people and scholars and sages. You can say that he's separate from. I'm going to go back to Kaddish and Kaddish in a second. The daf called over yesh is a dimyon nefelash navdallah. Specifically on something that has some similarity, can you say the expression havdalah separate? That even though they're similar, nevertheless they don't mix. He doesn't mix with it. Now he's bringing it back. The same thing is now with the separation of Chochma. They separate from being understood in seichel, from being comprehended in intelligence. We're not talking about the vision of Chochma, like you said earlier. That's not in the level of seichel. That's not intelligence. You're seeing something. The sight is what's powering it. It's not the intelligence of it. It's not in the level of comprehension. So you can't say Avdallah. The Chochma. Where could you say this of Avdallah of Kaddish on the seichel of Chochma, the intelligence of Chochma, the ima yesedei mila saga de binah, even though it has a similarity to the comprehension of binah. Hadizeh b'chinas Avdallah be'emes. In truth, it's separate. Masaga de binah, from the comprehension of binah. Mipnei she'etzem inyan hasichli de Chochma mitzadat milamel masaga be'emes kim b'chinas hanocha. Why? Because the real essence of the seichel of Chochma on its own is really higher. In truth, it's higher than comprehension. It's in a form of resonance, a form of conviction. And the fact that it's, at the end of the day it's still seichel intelligence, and then comes into comprehension. That which comes into comprehension is not the essence of this intelligence. Only the outer dimension. That comes through a concealment, through a diminishment canal, as he said earlier. Not here, in a few chapters back. And also to say this with Chochma is in a form of separation, who is also because comprehension is adding now another point. He's bringing out how Chochma is an in-between place. Riyah, seeing, and even higher, you can't even call it separate. You say Kaddish, Mila B'Gameh, you're saying, Kaddish, Mila B'Gameh, you're saying it stands on its own. Well, what are you negating? You're negating because you could think it has similarity, so you're saying no, it's beyond. And now he's adding an explanation behind that. After the first thing he said, because Chochma is mainly the conviction. Now he's saying, comprehension by definition means that you get Hasarvus Hadover, that what's the misyachid?
It's a new thing, right?
Yeah, it's a new thing. But what is he saying? It's a combination.
I can't tell you. That's what you're saying.
Okay, could be. Comes one with it. The masig and the musig. But it doesn't say that. What's adover shemisyachid im adover hamusig? Adover shemisyachid is what?
Is the binah. Im adover hamusig, what the thing that is comprehending, until they become one.
Okay, so the thing the comprehension is becoming one with the thing it's comprehending. Shula Chodim. V'hu mipnei shabasoga riba do b'chinas islapshus t'samamish b'kelim. Why is that? In other words,
They're able to do that.
he's adding a very important dimension here. In other words, when you comprehend something, you are becoming one with the thing you're comprehending. In Chochma, you'll see it's not that way.
Have something that's becoming
Yeah, because you're comprehending, because comprehension means that you manifest within containers. B'chinas er pnimi, in an internalized, integrated type of energy. That's total fusion, total union. But that which is separate from comprehension, meaning the hanocha, the conviction, that's in the form of separation. And this is the level of a reflection that's not nitfus, that's not graspable and not comprehensible at all. Just radiates above of his intelligence and of his comprehension. And this is the union of what? Yeah. This is the union of shemesh tzafal gabe yayin. There's a few laws regarding when you have oil, which rises, as we know, above water for sure, but even above wine. So water that floats, shetzafal gabe yayin. So you have, let's say, not water. I'm sorry, oil. Oil that's floating on top of wine. So it has different shalas. There's shal actually about akira hanocha also. Whether you remove it, is it removable? Are they one liquid, or is it actually like two substances? But there's also the din with tumah. If, for example, the wine is not pure wine, does it contaminate the oil? So in Perek Beis, in chapter 2, right, exactly. Do they mix or not? So in chapter 2 of Tful Yem is a Mishnah Hey, the Rabbanos Rileim She'ena Chibur. The Rabbanon, the sages, the rabbis say, they hold that they're not connected. Ki yayin hu binah, he's saying now the chassidus of it, because yayin, wine, is binah. That's already the root of ishtalshus. Mashenkin shemen shu b'chinas chochma. Oil is a level of chochma which is higher. As he said, moichin abba before is higher than ishtalshus. He's now adding now. Yeah, right. Now he's adding. Which level of chochma are we talking about? He's qualifying again very thoroughly. This is the higher level of chochma. That's higher because chochma is sometimes called water. Now we're suddenly calling chochma oil. The water of Chochma is the outer dimension of Chochma. That's the intelligence within Chochma. And the outer dimension of it. And oil, we can say, is the level of oil, light, which is like shemen here, that's higher than water. That does not mix. So we have the Rabbanan hold that there's no connection, meaning there's another opinion that there is. The Rabbanan, which is probably the halacha like them, that it's not connected, which means, because Chochma Bina, is going back to the case that he's making here, Chochma Bina are absolutely two distinct entities. For Ramaz, Pasha Emer, Daf Tzadik Dal Lamed Beis, and the Ramaz in Zohar, Pasha Emer, chapter, page 94b, Kosov B'Shem L'Kutei Torah Marizal, writes in the name of the L'Kutei Torah of the Arizal, Sheyesh B'Dikna Beis B'Chinas, that there is in the Dikna, in the beard, meaning in the hair of the beard, dikna. Yud Gimel Tikkunei dikna. Zokan. Dikna is Aramaic for zokan, a beard. Beis, there's two levels. Ha'echad, first level, b'chinas ha'sayid of Rishon Mitzias Ima. First is the level of hair, and that's the Mitzias of Ima Bina, the mother. V'habeis era primi sheyesh b'teicham. And then the second is the hair itself. There's two levels. There's the hair itself, that's Ima Bina, and there's the energy with inside the hair, Shemen Atev. He's going to discuss a lot later. This is the Shemen Atev, meaning Shemen Atev that is Atev that pours from it's talking about the oil, the good oil, the fine oil that pours from his beard. For whom it sees Abba, and that's the level of Abba, Shemen. Yeah, that's where he discusses this. 204. Remember, we discussed this thing. Yeah. So we see from all of this, move on. So from all this we can understand. Chochma is higher than from bina. It's not just there's more energy. That's fundamentally higher than bina. All started right.
It would be more air, then it wouldn't be a separate thing, right?
Yeah. Where did it begin? The subject. Yeah. I think it began. Lamed Zayin actually. Yeah. Yeah, because I wrote it, Sima Inyan Beperik Mem Gimel. Yeah. Okay. Let's read the Kitzur and we'll stop. However, Be'emes Gama Sichli D'Chochma Hanocha Sichlis. However, the truth is that even the Seichel of Chochma, the intelligence of wisdom, Hanocha Sichlis, it's the conviction of Seichel, Shehu Mitfisis Etzim Shalamayel Masag. They grasp the essence that's higher than comprehension. Lamatim Madreges Hariyah. He says clearly that's lower than the level of seeing. V'asichli hu chitzeni. And the intelligence of it, the comprehension of it, that's the external dimension. The intelligence within Chochma is the external dimension of Chochma. And that's why that which he feels he's convinced of in the spark, in the point of the concept, in Chochma is not necessarily, it's possible that it should not be so, the conviction shouldn't be in the comprehension level. And there are many common yonim.
Means which settles, that which settles in the Kudus.
Okay, but he means here leikzer meaning the attack of conviction.
Right.
That means by settle. The common yonim niflaim shel mal masog yishlam mokum b'seichel hachacham. There are several things. There are several awesome ideas that are higher than comprehension, and they still have a room in intelligence of wise people. And this hanocha, this leg, this conviction, this resonance adds power in the intelligence. What's comprehended in binah, that's the seichel, the intelligence part. This conviction is the level of ayin that's beyond she'enim musik, that's not comprehended. But it only adds power in intelligence. And this is what Chochma is, the higher intelligence, the higher perspective. Because it radiates the essence, the divine itness, yeshamiti of the essence, in a form of atzmi, essence. And which comes down in comprehension is only a reflection that is nullified and is insignificant compared to the source. And that's why it's called Kedesh. Because even the lower level of Chochma is also fundamentally higher than comprehension. And does not mix with the levels lower, like the oil that floats on top of the wine. And somewhere else he explains he's adding now something he doesn't say in the Prim. So elsewhere he says shemen saturates in everything. When you put something in oil, it saturates everything. It's not permeates, saturates. Yeah, and it does not, but it does not mix. So it goes everywhere, but it doesn't become one with everything. And that's the level of ein kadosh kashem. Nothing is kadosh. He says kadosh here. He probably means kadosh. Okay, there's nothing is kadosh like God, because God is completely everywhere, but separate from. So you see clearly that Chochma is a reflection of that type of higher dimension.
I don't know if he means Kaddish here because it's in the Makimache. He's qualifying it into parentheses. Makimache says that Hashem
so he's even Kaddish. Okay, even the lower level.
It's above, because it could still bring down the excitement to.
It mixes with it.
So when he says lower means the Riyah of Chochma, we don't even call separate from the side of Chochma. But Chochma, the primary part of Chochma, the upleg, the conviction, that is also separate from binah. That's like the wine, the oil on top of the wine. Okay, we'll stop here. So we did chapter 42, pages 71 through 70, to the top of 74.